Friends, hello. Today we'll discuss an interesting topic, being outside. The year is 1925. Our favorite writer, Bulgakov, wrote a work called Heart of a Dog. If you remember what the essence of this work is about, then they took the corpse of a drunkard, transplanted organs from this drunkard into a stray dog named Sharik, transplanted the pituitary gland and testicles, and gradually the dog began to turn into a human. And he would sing, yes. What does the story of Professor Preobrazhensky and his experiments have to do with my channel? The thing is, this doctor had a prototype, a real scientist who conducted experiments transplanting organs from humans to animals and from animals to humans. And today there will be a short story about why these experiments took place and how they are connected to human testosterone levels. And in general, today we will dive into the history of testosterone. How much did we, as humans, love to test our bodies for endurance, and what lengths did we go to in order for us to be men, in order to regain the lost years of youth? Well, shall we begin? Today, each of you knows that testosterone is a male hormone, that it is contained in our testicles, and it seems like every child knows this. You won't believe it, but in the past we didn't even suspect that male nature was in any way connected to our testicles. And only after many years of experiments and trials did people realize that the testicles are not in the scrotum for no reason. And it's not for nothing. People who lose them change psychologically and physically. And today we will see this for ourselves. Let's dive into the past. The first experiments related to changes in hormonal background were actually not about testosterone, but about castration. Castration is the removal of the testicles. Interestingly, in the past, it was used to treat epilepsy and gout due to specific attitudes at the time. So, imagine you have a seizure and they cut off your testicles. Your knee joint hurts, or let's say your knuckles hurt, and they cut off your testicles as a treatment. And interestingly, in cases of masturbation or madness, you could also expect this with good intentions. Castration. The most common reasons for castration. Actually, as you know, these were eunuchs in harems. And interestingly, the earliest documents that have been found are about eunuchs, state officials in China, and this dates back to around 1300 before Christ. And the system of these eunuchs, they were specially castrated so that they would be successful in government service, so that they wouldn't be distracted by women, so that they wouldn't be riding horses somewhere, but would focus only on state affairs. And interestingly, the last eunuch died. Just imagine, in 1996. His name was Sun Yat-sen, and at that time he was 94 years old. This procedure used to be quite bloody in the past, and it was done very unskillfully. And up to 25% of people who underwent castration died from infection or bleeding. And interestingly, the severed genitals were often kept in a special casket or chest. And by the way, you can clearly see this in the movie called The Last Emperor. If any of you have seen this movie, I think you'll remember. What's interesting is that one of the richest people in human history was a eunuch. This is Liu Qin, who is considered so wealthy that he accumulated, attention, 449,000 kilograms of gold and 9 million kilograms of silver. But in the end, criminal intrigue led to a tribunal and execution. It's also interesting that eunuchs existed, and we often find records about them as early as ancient Egypt. Eunuchs have existed in Assyria since the era of the legendary queen Semiriada around 800 before Christ. And this system developed and continued in the Islamic world, in the Middle East and North Africa for centuries. Slaves were deported from sub-Saharan African countries to Islamic cities and courts. And many of the slaves who survived the exhausting journey across the desert were then castrated to serve as black laborers, guards, administrators, or soldiers. And some of them were castrated because they worked in brothels. This prevented them from causing pregnancy in those who used their services. There are many different stories about how entire armies were castrated, and by the way, you can also see this in the television series Game of Thrones. Sometimes this served as punishment for someone who was unfaithful, and sometimes it was done to prevent someone from continuing their lineage when they were overthrown from the throne. And I think you've heard more than once that even in the modern world, sometimes someone's genitals are cut off for some not very respectable act, which we often see even in some of our regions. Sometimes castration was done purely for practical reasons. As you know, a young man around the age of 14 or 15, when puberty happens and he goes through adolescence, his voice changes. And back then, when women were forbidden to be, for example, church choir teachers, boys who had very high voices were specifically castrated. And so that they could continue to sing and not lose their voice even after they grew up. One of the most famous castrati like that, and by the way, there's also a movie about him, is Carlo Farinelli and Domenico Annibaldi. Interestingly, there is a retrospective study where they compared the lifespan of people who were castrated with those who lived as their peers. And interestingly, according to this study from the 1500s, the lifespan did not change. According to this study, the average lifespan of people after castration was 64.4 years, while those who lived and were not castrated had an average lifespan of only 65.5 years. So as you can see, castration and possibly, as I've said many times, anti-aging, which we associate with testosterone and its good levels, hormone replacement therapy will not extend your life, but you might be able to improve its quality. So if someone tells you that you'll live longer on hormone replacement therapy, I would seriously doubt that specialist competence. Now let's talk about charlatans. Wherever there was human interest, swarms of charlatans would always flock like bees to honey, and testosterone is no exception. And the first charlatan was Gaius Pliny Secundus. He recommended eating animal testicles. He was the first to say that you should take bull testicles, dry them, use them as food, and then everything will be fine for you. And by the way, there were a lot of such charlatans. Interestingly, this is an important fact. Testosterone is produced by the testicles, but unlike thyroid hormones in the thyroid gland, is barely stored there. And one of the most famous elixirs was a drug that became popular in 1920. And by the way, it can still sometimes be found on the market even now. It's called Acasa, which, among other ingredients, also contains dried testicles and a small amount of what is believed to be testosterone, which, as you can imagine, could only be determined by 1970. A very important stage in life, in general, hormone replacement therapy. We're now getting closer to Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, and you'll soon understand its meaning. The turning point was the research of Charles Brown Séquard, who was a very famous scientist with an outstanding, spotless reputation. He was highly respected around the world. He was a member of several scientific academies, and he published the results of his famous self-experimentation. Allow me to read it out. He gave himself daily injections of 1 ml of a mixture consisting of 1 part venous blood from the testicle, 1 part semen, and 1 part juice extracted from the testicles of a dog or guinea pig. After 20 days, he made remarkable observations about himself. I'm quoting him. Major changes happened. In myself, I regained at least all the strength I had many years ago. I was able to conduct experiments for several hours. After dinner, I managed to write an article on a very complex topic. My limbs, tested with a dynamometer, increased in strength by 6 to 7 kilograms. Urine flow and bowel movement strength have increased. And of course, when this study came out, it attracted a huge amount of attention and people immediately became interested. And we want that too. And where there is people's attention and interest, demand always arises and supply appears, including from various charlatans and fraudsters. Transplantation. In general, the history of transplantation was started by Frank Liston in Chicago. He was one of the first to perform human testicle transplants from donors after experiments on animals. And by the way, modern experiments are also quite interesting. In the Soviet Union, experiments with human testicle transplantation continued at least until 1980. In Vienna, Augensteinach lived in 1861 and performed vasoligation for rejuvenation on 34 people followers. And one of his followers, by the way, who also began experiments in this direction was Sergei Voronov. And he turned to xenotransplantation. This is exactly the transplantation between animals and humans, which is exactly what you see in the story Heart of a Dog. It was Serge Voronov who became the prototype for the character in Mikhail Bulgakov's book Heart of a Dog, namely Professor Preobrazhensky. In 1884, 18-year-old Sergei left Voronezh to study medicine in Paris at the Sorbonne, where he became interested in endocrinology and transplantation. He taught his surgeon and eugenicist Alexis Carrel, and from 1889 he worked under the physiologist Charles Brown Séquard. Do you remember this name and what he invented? He hypothesized that sex gland extracts have positive effects on the body. From there, he went to Egypt as a doctor, where he worked until 1910. In Cairo, he observed eunuchs. He noticed that they lacked beards, had small skulls, were overweight, had a high vocal range, and were different from a person whose gonads were normal. And this led Voronov to the idea that the absence of testicles has a destructive effect on the functioning of the endocrine organs and on the condition of the body as a whole. Similar symptoms were observed in healthy older men, which indicated a gradual decline in the function of the endocrine organs, causing aging. And Serge Voronov decided to influence the endocrine organs by transplanting donor organs. Let's discuss his successful experiments. Voronov began experimental research aimed at solving this issue in 1913 at the physiological station of the Collège de France. At first, he worked on transplant techniques and studied the body's reaction to a foreign organ. Before transplanting the gonads, he conducted experiments with less complex organs, such as the thyroid gland. In that year, at least according to records, he cured a 14-year-old teenager. Due to measles, the teenager developed thyroid problems, and his mother donated her thyroid for a transplant. And after the thyroid transplant, the boy's mood gradually returned. He became more active, and his vital processes began to recover. He considered this method of transplanting organs from healthy people to sick ones to be an elixir of youth, and his experiments did not stop there. During World War I, Voronov transplanted bone tissue to the wounded, often using the patient's own tissue. It would fuse faster. Subtitles by Dima Tozok. And of course, these experiments attracted enormous attention from people, and on June 12, 2020, in Paris, Serge Voronov performed the first transplantation of a monkey's seminal gland to a human. This was the first time he successfully transplanted primate testicles to a human. As a result, at least by descriptions, the person became stronger. Energy. And all these studies were published and illustrated with photographs of the patient before and after. And if you search the internet, you can find photos where the before and after really show a striking difference. Voronov performed about 50 monkey testicle transplants on patients aged 40 to 59 between 2020 and 2024. For those who felt tired and sensed that old age had come, most of the operated patients experienced improvements in their physical and psychological condition. The effect of the surgery lasted from several weeks to 2 years. Let me quote. For example, here is a 74-year-old English official who came to Voronov in 1920, a hunched old man, overweight with sagging facial features, a dull look in his eyes, walking with difficulty, leaning on a cane. His memory is very weak, and his mind works sluggishly and slowly. After the operation performed in February 1921, the Englishman lost half of his excess weight. He slimmed down, became cheerful, with a clear look in his eyes and a straight posture. In 1924, Voronov made a series of trips to Algeria and Morocco, and he trained veterinarians in transplantation so that they could improve livestock breeds. As a result of the operations performed at that time, they observed increased hair growth. According to the press, in 1905, as well as in our Soviet publication, Izvestia, the scientist performed rejuvenation operations on Clemenceau himself and Lloyd George. There were also many frankly fantastic reports in the country of the Soviets. In 1926, Ogonyok magazine reported that the scientists planned to observe a monkey pregnant with a human baby in the lab. The information caused a huge stir, but in the next article, "Can a monkey give birth to a human?" it was reported that the experiment was successful, but the scientist does not intend to continue it since it is physically impossible. At the same time, there is no mention of such experiments in Voronov's own works. Another scientist, zoologist I.I., studied the issue of crossbreeding humans and anthropoid apes, Ivanov, who collaborated with the Pasteur Institute in Paris. In 1926, he traveled to Africa to test artificial insemination of female chimpanzees using human sperm. He was unsuccessful and kept working at the Soviet monkey nursery in Sukhumi. By the way, I lived across the road from that nursery. Baboons would occasionally escape from that nursery, and they were quite aggressive. One of them even almost bit me. That's true. Serge Voronov's experiments inspired rejuvenation research in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, including work by Koltsov, director of the Institute of Experimental Biology. His student, biologist Zavodovsky, performed several animal rejuvenation operations at the Moscow Zoo laboratory. Zavodovsky studied the activity of the endocrine glands, while a surgeon named Zamkov questions effects of gland transplants on the body. However, there were no direct followers of Voronov in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Voronov's worldwide fame and his method could not help but leave a mark on popular culture. Not only Bulgakov used the idea of rejuvenation according to Voronov. The science fiction genre, which blossomed in 1920, made extensive use of it. For example, in the novel by Alexander Belyaev, The Man Who Lost His Face, Dr. Sorokin from San Francisco transforms human appearance using hormone therapy. In Belyaev's novel Amphibian Man, for instance, Dr. Salvatore is engaged in organ transplantation. The plot about a scientist who created a rejuvenation serum based on donor blood from a primate is also found in Arthur Conan Doyle's story, The Man on All Fours. Over time, popularity faded, and by the 1930s, scathing newspaper articles increased until the rejuvenation theory was completely disproved. But still, his experimental research gave an impulse to the development of transplantology and endocrinology, and Voronov's idea continues to live on in the pages of science fiction. People have always been interested in organ transplants, and of course, the interest in testicle transplants has decreased. Then, in 1931, when Butenandt isolated the androgenic steroid androsterone from urine. By the way, he needed as much as 15 tons of urine for this. By the way, this urine was collected from young police officers in Berlin. This urine was then processed by Schering to obtain only 15 milligrams of the first androgen. In 1935, Ernst Lacour and his group in Amsterdam extracted and isolated 10 milligrams of testosterone from 100 kilograms of bull testicles, which they found to be more active than androsterone, and they named it testosterone. That was the first time in the world the word testosterone was mentioned. In the same year, Butenandt and Hanisch in Göttingen, as well as Ruzicka in Basel, published the chemical synthesis of testosterone. This made it possible to begin modern clinical pharmacological research and the use of testosterone in male reproductive physiology. The synthesis of testosterone became clinically available first in the form of pellets and then as injectable esters, that is, testosterone propionate. With a very crucial situation during division, it was unclear. Also in 1936, positivist won testosterone. Testosterone was replaced by continuation oral effectiveness. However, due to its structure, it turned out to be very toxic to the liver, which generally gave testosterone a bad reputation among doctors, since this toxicity was also suspected in relation to testosterone and injectable forms. At the end of the 1970s, an effective oral testosterone ondecanoate was added to the range of testosterone drugs used in clinical practice, which is absorbed from the intestine through the lymphatic system. In the 1950s and 1960s, the pharmaceutical industry became more interested in new androgens than in testosterone itself, and it focused its androgen research on the chemical modification of steroid molecules. In order to separate the different effects of testosterone and produce predominantly erythropoietic or anabolic steroids, it turned out to be impossible to obtain androgens with only one effect from the spectrum of testosterone's activity. At best, it was possible to emphasize one of these effects, but the other effects remained. By 1956, modern textbooks on androgens had already described 256 androgenic steroids, and by 1976, their number had increased to more than 1,000. It was not possible to find a steroid with a purely anabolic effect on muscles or bones for the treatment of cachexia, osteoporosis, or short stature, or with a purely erythropoietic effect for the treatment of anemia without androgenization. Therefore, when bodybuilders use testosterone, whether they want it or not, their blood becomes thicker and, for example, they experience androgenic alopecia. The general opinion was that the main goal of therapy is to replace testosterone levels as close to physiological as possible. In the mid-1990s, transdermal testosterone patches applied to the skin of the scrotum became the first transdermal testosterone medication to be used clinically. They were invented by Virzuplice from Alza in Palo Alto, a company specializing in new delivery forms of known medications. The medication with the highest concentration of testosterone was also tested for application on the scrotum, but due to the high absorption capacity of scrotal skin, only 20% of the gel needed for non-scrotal application was required. What makes this form of application economical and possibly more environmentally desirable? But by no means am I encouraging you to apply androgel to your scrotum. In 2004, the first preparation of ondecanoate testosterone for intramuscular injection entered the market, which soon became very popular as a true depot testosterone preparation. This is the so-called Nebido, which is so loved by modern urologists. Testosterone ondecanoate was originally used in capsules for oral administration. Few doctors even know about this, but Chinese researchers turned this depot testosterone drug into an injectable medication. We use tea seed oil as a carrier and then castor oil as a carrier. All the scary stories about testosterone and the modern issues doctors have with testosterone are connected to the discovery for which Higgins received the Nobel Prize in 1941. Higgins said that prostate cancer is activated by testosterone injections. Indeed, there are hormone-dependent forms of malignant tumors, which include breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. And so when we found out that if a person already has prostate cancer, removing testosterone from the body stops the cancer from growing, but if a person doesn't have cancer, testosterone does not cause prostate cancer. But unfortunately, this connection in people who already have prostate cancer has led many doctors, even today, to fear hormone replacement therapy in patients with cancer, in patients with a poor cancer history, and to believe that testosterone really leads to the development of cancer. That's not true. If we are talking about physiological levels, hormone replacement therapy is absolutely safe, and today we even use it in patients since there is radical treatment for hormone-dependent prostate cancer tumors. What was the point of today's lecture anyway? It was filled with a huge number of funny, amusing, probably some silly facts that each of you knows today. But before people would fly to the other side of the world for this kind of transplant, pay huge amounts of money, stand in line. We've always been manipulated, and people have always tried to make money off us. And today, you need to be extremely skeptical about everything you hear. Believe me, in 20, 40, 50, or even 100 years, much of what some scientists claim today with a serious face will end up being just as much of a farce. And there will be much more adequate, better, and safer ways to extend a person's life and restore their quality of life. So thank you for listening until the end. I hope you found it interesting and maybe even useful. See you soon.